This is the old mast partner from Alicios, which came out when the mast came out, and it's just a mess. So I'm going to rebuild this, only instead of covering it with this vinyl stuff, I'm just going to make it out of plywood, and I'll practice my epoxy technique. So I'll fiberglass and epoxy this thing, and we'll see how that goes. By the way, just in case this thing falls apart, which I suspect it very well may, I made a template while I was on the boat yesterday out of cardboard. These holes were relief holes for the bottom bolts, the nuts and bolts that were holding the mast partner to the deck. Well, it's been not quite 24 hours. I came down after dinner last night after maybe four or 5 hours, and the epoxy was not setting up. So I set up this little space heater thing and came down and checked before I went to bed, and it was doing much better. So it seems still maybe a little gummy, and I guess this is why you practice with epoxy. I think the problem was that it was too cool, and problem number one. Problem number two, well, I think problem number two is the same problem. So when I mixed the epoxy, it was very thick and viscous, and it was hard to mix. So maybe I didn't get it completely mixed up. I mean, stuff still feels a little sticky. The other thing I don't know if you'll be able to see on the camera, but the surface is very rough, very, I don't know if it raised the grain. I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but I'm going to try to sand it and see how that goes. I'm a little concerned that sanding isn't going to go too well just because of the fact that it's still kind of a little bit tacky. Maybe instead of practicing on something that it took me a couple hours to cut out, I should have practiced on just a piece of scrap wood, but well, we'll see. The other thing is that if I really had, knew what I was doing, I think I probably would have gone ahead and laminated these two pieces. So I coated this, just to back up, I coated this with epoxy so that when I did do the glue up in the lamination, I wouldn't end up with a resin poor laminate. So this first coat is really just to seal the wood. Then I'm going to put thickened epoxy in between these two pieces. Before I do that, I'm going to drill out my big relief holes, and so the thickened epoxy will glue these together, and then I'm going to practice on the surface of this, the part that shows, which will be this side, with some chop-strand and resin. Okay, so that's the plan. I don't know. Totally going up. Well, you could argue that I've done this all in the wrong order. I need to be right. The way this goes together, this goes up against the cabin top from underneath, and these holes are the relief holes for the bolts that hold the mast partner on top of the deck. It actually goes like this. This is the front fore and aft. I think I marked it. Yep. And then this extra piece that I'm laminating on is going to be the part that shows inside the cabin, inside the boat. So it'll hide those things. So now I've got raw exposed wood in here, which is going to need another coat of resin before we do the laminating. I think I'll just do that all at the same time. So that's it. I'm waiting for Cab-O-Sil, which I hadn't ordered anything to thicken the epoxy with before, so I left that out. So that should come tomorrow, and we'll sort of finish this thing up. I think what I'm going to do is pay a lot more attention to the thickness of the epoxy when I'm mixing it. So I got to pre-warm it, as Andy at Boatworks today suggests. I think the temperature will probably do it. So I want the resin to be thin when I do the lamination with the chop-strand here. All right, that's the plan. Okay, I'm doing things a little, I'm gonna do the lamination. The Cab-O-Sil showed up, and my tongue depressor / stir sticks showed up. So I'm going to go ahead today and laminate these two pieces together, as I described earlier. I'm going to do things a little bit differently. So I have warmed up both the resin and the hardener in front of this my little space heater for about 20 or 30 minutes. They're nice and warm, feeling warm to the touch. I'm also going to wipe down the two mating surfaces with this dewaxer stuff. And I'm going to mix up some resin, coat the inside of these, the sort of the end grain of the plywood in here with unthickened epoxy. And then I'm going to go ahead and thicken the batch that I mix up. And that batch I'll thicken with Cab-O-Sil. And then I made a little kind of a half-assed spreading trowel. So I'm going to use this to spread a layer of thickened epoxy on here and see how this all goes. That seemed to work pretty well. The epoxy was definitely much less viscous due to the extra heat that I added to the resin and the hardener before I mixed them together. So they kind of went in, and I could see it penetrating into the end grain in those little holes in the one piece much better this time. The Cab-O-Sil went into somewhere like between mayo and peanut butter consistency, and my stupid little spreading trowel, it was pretty crummy. I need to get a real trowel. So it seemed to go pretty well. I'm gonna keep the little heater on it tonight, and we'll see how this comes out tomorrow. Well, I'll call that a success. The excess thickened epoxy that I blobbed up here is totally cured. So I think that the warming of the resin and keeping the heater on overnight did the trick. So I'm going to put a layer of chop-strand over this. Now I don't really have to do that for this piece, but as I've mentioned, this is my practice for the dinghy, so I'm going to go ahead and practice with some chop-strand. Well, I can't really call that a success. I think I got the top laminated, but I was unable to really get the chop strand to stick to the edges. I think going around that sharp corner, that sharp 90-degree corner to get to the edge was more than it was capable of doing. So I'm going to probably end up grinding away all of the chop strand that's on the edge. But, you know, that's why we practice. Well, they say you learn from your mistakes, right? So I've learned a lot. First thing I learned was that the way I cleaned up my tools was not good enough. So now I've frozen my little pin roller. I'll have to try to fix that. That's one thing. Another thing is I made a gigantic mess here on my already fairly messy workbench. But the big thing was I learned about things not to do when doing chop strand. And one of them is trying to go around sharp corners without, you know, if I were wrapping both sides of this, that would be one thing. But I wasn't. So I completely failed to get any adhesion on the edges of my board. I did okay in the middle here, some messy spots. So I'm just going to cut off everything that's not on the top surface. And as I mentioned, no adhesion around the edges, so cutting that away is okay. But you can, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on camera, but I got good wet out in most areas, except for right in here. And I think you can see the color, this is lighter here. So I don't think I got good lamination either here or down here. And those were two places where I was really trying to wrap the chop strand around this tight radius. And I think by wrapping it inside here and over here, I lifted it up from off here. So that's a lesson learned. As I mentioned before, oh, and also there's a glob here. That's just being sort of careless, but that'll sand away. So this is not intended to be structural, because it's just going to be on the inside of the boat up here. And so this is the cosmetic surface, and I will not try to repair these areas because it doesn't really make any difference. What I will do is reseal all the edges with some resin, just to make sure that I've got a good waterproof surface. This surface, the side facing up, will receive some, water leaking in through the mast partner. So I want this to be very, very well sealed, and I'll ensure that. This surface I'm going to fair with the epoxy fairing compound and paint. And this will be as I said, this will be the cosmetic surface that you'll see from inside the boat. Well, I think we're finished with the construction and laminating process, and we're going to move on to the finishing process. This came out pretty good. This is the surface that This is the surface that I just resealed with some unthickened epoxy, and it came out real smooth. I see no evidence of any amine blush, which sometimes is a problem, but I don't have that. The edges seem to be all really nicely sealed. The only downside was that, and if I hold it up like this, you might be able to see that the unthickened epoxy resin was runny enough that it dripped. So I've got some drips on the fiberglass side of this that are going to have to be smoothed off before I fair it with the fairing compound. So anyway, overall, I'm pretty happy with that. We'll go ahead and proceed with the finishing process. And so for finishing, I'm going to, again, as this is my practice piece, I'm going to fair it with Total Boat Total Fair fairing compound. I'll sand it, and when I do the dinghy, of course, that sanding will start with longboarding, but this is too small to bother with, so I'll just do this whole thing with my random orbital sander. Then I'm going to prime it with 2-part epoxy primer, and then I have to decide what color I want it to be. The headliner of Alicios is white, so I could leave this white depending on what the primer ends up looking like, so I could just prime it and stop there. Or, because I only have the Fighting Lady yellow gel coat for the outside and the gray, what is it called? Kingston gray or something like that, topside paint for the inside, I could either make a contrasting gray color or just leave that off. So we'll see what I decide later. this video is getting pretty long. What's left to go is just the sanding the fairing compound and then priming and maybe painting, depending on how pretty the white primer ends up looking. So I think I'll end it here. I have learned a lot, and it probably took me 3 times longer to do this little project than it would if I knew what I was doing in the first place. I guess I know more now than when I started. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.